All right, so hi everyone. Today we are going to be looking at some of the issues related to illegal and unregulated fishing in the MENA region. There's lots to talk about, so we're going to get through this. One of the major pieces of global collaboration, if you will, was set out in 1982, and it was the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea. And this is a global law that many countries have signed on to and are now party to. The concept that we have to manage our fisheries within a certain region of our own coastline, right? So the law of the sea is a combination of customs and treaties and international agreements with various governments in different countries, which tries to maintain the order and productivity, the sustainability of the fishery, and having a peaceful relationship with other countries at sea. So obviously, there's been a lot of contested waters in the MENA region, and this law in 1982 really made a big difference to how the world was viewing the fisheries. And the new exclusive economic zone that was set up extended the area from your coastline from about 3 miles, 3 nautical miles, to 200 nautical miles offshore from your coastline. So that having a section of the sea which is basically owned, right, for want of a better word, by the country, allows them to have exclusive rights to that region. And that includes the fisheries, it includes the resources that are on the ocean floor, and the energy production. So if you were to install offshore wind power, for example, that would be your rights within that 200 nautical miles. Not all countries are sort of adhering to this 200 miles. Some of them still prefer the 3 to 4 or 10 nautical miles from the coastline. So it depends on the country, but you are only allowed up to an amount of 200 nautical miles, nothing further than that. Excuse me. Outside of the 200 nautical miles region becomes international waters, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. So this is a map that is the latest that describes who is signed on to the Law of the Sea, this convention. The light blue and dark blue are areas within the world that have signed on to the convention, and the pinkish areas are countries that are signatories, but they haven't completely ratified the agreement with the UN. And the countries in red are ones that have not signed on and have not joined the convention. So I know we're talking about MENA region, and so you can see there's a couple of countries in there that are within the MENA region that have either not signed on at all or haven't completely ratified their contract, their agreement with the UN. But I just find it staggering that still the United States is not a party of the convention, even though they were one of the original architects of the agreement with the United Nations back in 1982. They still won't sign on for reasons that were given, political reasons, essentially, that Article 9 of the convention, which deals with the exclusive economic zone, there's people in various politicians, and is usually Republicans, they don't agree that 200 nautical miles is an appropriate distance from your coastline. So there's, it's been going on for a long time, and it just doesn't seem to ever, the United States never seems to want to change the position of joining the convention. Which makes it kind of tricky because you're dealing with a global convention, and everybody wants to fish the world fairly and have equity involved. And so a global treaty only works if the world is willing to sign on. But the vast majority of the countries are signed on, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's perfect. And we'll see that a little bit later on. So how is this exclusive economic zone determined? Like I said, nations that they're allowed up to 200 nautical miles, but there are some nations, some countries that they're close enough to their bordering countries across the sea that it is not 200 miles. So they have to produce agreements among their countries to determine what is equitable between the countries and delineate their exclusive economic zone based on their agreement between the countries. And in these cases, the UN plays a role in determining which countries get what section of the sea. So I thought what I would do is hop over to Google Earth Pro, because I wanted to draw your attention to something. If we look at oops, let me move this out of the way. There we go. If we look at, for instance, the United Arab Emirates, let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. I need to get out of that. And is that maybe in the way? No. Okay, well, there we go. So if you take a look at the United Arab Emirates, that's this region here, and here is southern Iran right here. Obviously, you can see that this distance here is quite short, and if we were to take a quick measurement to see in nautical miles how far away that is, it's only 42 miles, 42 nautical miles. So, of course, this is a problem when you're trying to delineate your exclusive economic zone. And even if we look at, oops, I need to clear that. If we look at this region from Iran, this is Oman, even that is still short of 200 nautical miles. So you can see that it can be kind of complicated trying to determine what is your exclusive economic zone. Take, for example, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. There's the Red Sea right here, and it is very small, 138.5 nautical miles. So, and let's take a look at Somalia. So here is the Horn of Africa. This is Somalia, and Yemen over here. There is less than 200 nautical miles between their borders. Take Djibouti and Yemen. Oops, I need to clear that. Very close, only 13 nautical miles-ish, right? So what this really demonstrates is how quickly complicated it can be to try to ratify agreements based on your exclusive economic zone if you're not able to, I guess, come up with an agreement. And in the MENA region, there's multiple countries that are facing that problem. So if we can zoom out a little bit, you can see, for sure, the United Arab Emirates, the Horn of Africa, the whole of the Red Sea, and even some of the Mediterranean countries will be less than 200 nautical miles. So for some countries in North Africa, it could be quite easy, and even Yemen, for example, parts of the coastline will have no interruptions whatsoever. But when you come into the area where you have islands that are owned by different nations, that then becomes another sticky point, because this can have up to 200 nautical miles from the coastline on this side, but not on this side, if you see what I mean. So hopefully this demonstrates to you just how complicated it can really get when we're trying to come up with global agreements based on things that have been agreed upon in Geneva, for example, that may not necessarily work for every country. That's why we need global collaboration if we're going to go anywhere with trying to manage our fisheries. Um, One of the biggest problems facing our fishery, have I gone too far? No. Um, One of the major issues facing global fisheries, of course, is the idea that there is still rampant, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing that's going on globally. And it has been recognized as one of the most severe threats to sustainability when it comes to our fish stocks. Not properly regulating a fishery can have devastating impacts on that population. It can have devastating impacts on the marine ecosystems as well if you're not able to regulate fishing gear, for example, the way in which fishermen are taking fish and other aquatic life. It can compromise local food security as well. Illegal fishing can take away opportunities from legitimate fishermen that have legitimate licenses to be in the waters. And if there's rampant illegal fishing going on, then it compromises their local food security, of course. And it also compromises their livelihood. There's, fishing piracy that's occurring around the world and robbing local people of their own livelihood. So IUU refers to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, and those catches globally have been reported between 13 and 31% of all catches, and in some cases it can be over 50%. And as we'll see in some of the MENA region, by and large, the illegal fishing that's going on is sometimes greater than the legal fishing. So that can have a real problem when it comes to fisheries management. How can you manage a fishery and determine the catch amounts based on your stock assessments of your legal catch, and you'll have to account for the illegal operation that's occurring and then factor that into your estimates of how much fish you can take in a season. So it's an extremely complicated, really messy job to be dealing with, and it's a $1 billion industry. Illegal fishing is estimated to be between 10 and $23.5 billion a year. So there's a lot at stake, and countries that are faced with failing agricultural systems because of climate change, for example, in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Sudan, parts of those of the world that is receiving more and more droughts and unpredictable weather, farmers are being forced to find food somewhere else, and oftentimes illegal fishing is an attractive option. So it is an absolutely massively immense problem within the world, for sure. So during legal operations, you have to, once the ships who have legitimate licenses to be fishing, they return to the docks, and there is a reporting procedure of their catch and their landings, right? So the catch is referring to how much they've caught while they were fishing, and their landings is how much they've actually brought back. So you're probably all aware that there is a lot of bycatch that occurs. And those numbers are most likely grossly underestimated because of illegal fishing. They're not reporting the complete catch, and they're not reporting any of those landings of the bycatch as well. But anyway, so countries are required by the FAO to report their catch and landings. And the FAO is then responsible for regulating the fisheries based on their reports. So the FAO, they compile reports and the analysis, and they disseminate all of that fishery data to other countries, and they then use that to try to determine what the catch limits should be based on the catch and landing reports. The FAO is also in charge of managing conservation of aquatic resources. So they collect and distribute those key statistics of the sector activities. And the sector activities would be things like trawling for fish, dredging for fish, those different types of activities within the fishing industry. They have developed the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries documents, which are binding legal agreements between countries that then, have some kind of compliance and issuance of guidelines for how that country will fish. They have guidelines and manuals and information systems that really try to address the issues of global fisheries. And it's a huge undertaking. And from all of that data, they then produce fishing or fisheries policies for global fisheries. Within the Persian Gulf, which you can see in the top right image over here, here's the Persian Gulf. So UAE right here and Iran, just to get you orientated. The statistics are supposed to be submitted annually by Persian Gulf countries to the United Nations FAO, but they oftentimes will not report on the illegal activity, right? Because it's illegal. So it's often not reported, and that then has an impact on your stock assessments. Researchers from the University of British Columbia, they have done a study. This is an image taken from Google Earth on one of their studies to try to estimate a better catch estimate from the fishing in it was 1 year. They tried to make an estimate and compare that to what was reported by the Persian Gulf countries. They were using Google Earth satellite imagery to determine, this is fishing gear here, so they've set their nets, long lines and pens that are set up for the fishing that's going on the coastline. And so they were trying to locate all of these different operations that were going on, and through their best guesses, through measuring in Google Earth, just how we did in Google Earth Pro, and you can measure using that line tool, they're trying to estimate based on the tackle length and all of that, the catch that could have been produced from satellite imagery, right? And the researchers estimated that in the Persian Gulf fish catch in 2005, it was 31,433 tons, which was about 6 times what nations bordering the Persian Gulf had reported. So this is just one study that is really eye-opening and showing just how serious the issue is of numbers that are reported and numbers that are actually really going on. And so no wonder there's a global collapse in our fishing stocks, in our fish stocks around the world based on illegal fishery. So the sustainable harvest of living marine resources is absolutely critical to the economic prosperity of all nations. And as you can see from this graph, the global fisheries are crashing, and they have been since 1950. About 85% of all of our fish stocks, all of the fish species, so that includes finfish and seafood, so crustaceans and other aquatic life, 85% of all known fish species are either fully or partially overexploited. So this is a crisis globally, and a lot of it has to do with the illegal side of fishing. The graph is showing you that trend over time. This was from the FAO, and showing you the solid red line is showing you the actual numbers of the fish declines. This is percent of species collapsed. So we're looking at right now, at least in 2002 or something like that, we were at about 25% of all of our fish species have actually collapsed now, so fully exhausted. And the trend is set to continue, and that by 2050, we're expecting that 100% of all fish species could face a complete collapse and are no longer profitable to be fishing for. So it's a huge issue, one that is really severe, that the world is trying to trying to fix, but it is just inherently difficult. So a couple of examples that I wanted to talk about. One is Somalia. So before we get into some of the details about what are the problems in Somalia, I thought I would discuss some of the regulations that are in place and the policies. Somalia is a party to the Law of the Sea, so they did sign on and ratify their contract to observe the conservation of the Law of the Sea. But obviously that is not the be all and end all, because there's lots of illegal activity going on. The fisheries legislation was first introduced in Somalia with the 1959 Maritime Code, and that served as the foundation for the current Somali maritime regulations and provides an overview of fishing activities. Under this law, it prohibits certain fishing activities, for example, dynamite fishing, which you can see in that image at the top right-hand corner of the slide. Dynamite fishing, of course, is a really devastating activity. It's literally throwing dynamite into the water, and it makes a big explosion. And what it'll do is it'll temporarily stun a lot of the fish that are underwater. Of course, the fish that are underwater. It will stun a lot of the fish, and then they float to the surface, and using nets, they can just collect the fish that have been disturbed, from the sonic boom, and scoop them out of the sea that way. So it's easy, it's quick, but of course it's extremely devastating, because you throw a stick of dynamite over a coral reef, for example, you're decimating the coral reef, as well as getting everything else that's in the water. So having that as part of their law is really important. Under that law as well, they establish a vessel concession and licensing system. So fishermen have to register their fishing boats, and they have to receive a fishing license to partake in the fishing seasons for different fish stocks. The reading for this week was chapter 6 in Environmental Politics in the Middle East, and the chapter goes into quite some detail about the Somalia situation and piracy and illegal operations within Somalia. And in your book, it refers to the fact that for a while, Somalia was legally deprived of a territorial sea and an exclusive economic zone. However, there are some people that disagree with that statement that was made in your book. During the transitional government that was supported by the United Nations and others, proclaimed the exclusive economic zone in 2014. So the idea that they didn't have an economic zone and it was a free-for-all for other nations is not quite as accurate. And I just wanted to point that out, that since 2014 they have had their exclusive economic zone. But what that means is they have had for decades, forever, they've had unregulated fishing occurring off the coastline of Somalia. And it is true that there was a lot of illegal fishing activity going on in Somali waters from other countries. One of the reasons that the illegal activity in Somalia is so rampant is that, for several reasons, there's an weak and very small navy. So even though there are legislations in place and governments have ratified contracts and whatnot, enforcement is basically non-existent, right? So you can have fishermen that have a license to be fishing, and you can have illegal fishers right next to each other, and nothing is done about it, because there's just nobody on the sea patrolling and enforcing those regulations. Flagships are another issue that allows for the illegal operations. Flagships are referring to fishing vessels that literally fly a flag from a different country other than the one they're fishing in. So it's called flags of convenience. So a fisherman or a company that has a fishing fleet can register their vessels in a different country, and they fly that flag of the country, but they are actually really a Somali ship, for example, and they're operating in the EEZ of that country. Another problem is ports of convenience. So these are ports of convenience, are referring to maritime ports that basically turn a blind eye to any illicit activity that's going on. So when the illegal ships come to port to distribute their landings and sell it to whoever is buying, there's very little enforcement or regulation. So there's not many people checking their licenses or looking at their catch. Did they get the right size of fish? Did they get their quota that was legal? So there's just such weak monitoring going on at these ports that it allows for rampant illegal fishing in that region in Somalia. I wanted to show you guys the exclusive economic zone that was determined in 2014, and this economic zone was agreed upon, and you can see in this yellowy orange area is the Somali area that is being fished. The blue outline is the area that was originally ratified, and the hash lines through here are contested areas. So this section of the Somalia EEZ is contested with Yemen, and right down here we have an area that's contested with Kenya. So these two sections of the sea are really quite dangerous to be in. It's not a part of the world that you would just, go fishing, because it's rampant for piracy, it's rampant for illegal activity, so it's a real mess. There is a report, I put the link up here, a fisheries report, and it really is it's an extremely long document, but it goes into excruciating detail about how Somalia can secure their fisheries, and moving forward, how can they make it more sustainable. So if you were curious, that this figure came from that report, you can go ahead and click on that and see for yourself what's been going on. So another reason why illegal activity is so rampant in Somalia is the idea that it's almost like an organized crime network. So some scholars believe that the piracy is occurring in Somalia because there's actually coordinated efforts going on between the Somali government, the authorities, the military, and there's commercial players too that are supporting the illegal fisheries and piracy. And there's also some collaboration with neighboring countries like Kenya and Yemen. So the idea that there is so much collaboration between all these groups is one reason why illegal fisheries and piracy is so rampant in Somalia. Also, it's the fact that Somalia has just had such a rough go of it with its government that, the state collapse has been linked to piracy, undoubtedly. There's just such lack of enforcement. There's really no resources, no resources to build their military and build their enforcement agencies. So a lot of this just goes unseen. And there's also a huge black market for forged licenses, so that they're actually illegally operating, but they look like they're legal based on having their forged fishing licenses. So there's lots of moving parts, and it's not just a simple fix. Figuring out how Somalia will, get out of this activity that they're in and get towards a more sustainable way of fishing is, extremely difficult. It's not just, it's social, it's governmental, it's community, it's everything. It's climate change. I mean, it all plays into why piracy and illegal fishing activity is so rampant. Over the last 10 years, the estimates of fish that has been caught in Somali waters is around 1 million tons of fish. So there's a lot of fishing activity that's going on in Somali waters, and it's not just Somali pirates, right? There's a lot of other countries that are also illegally fishing in Somali waters. So other MENA countries, for instance, Iran and Yemen and Egypt. Iran is probably the biggest one. Here we have this graph that's showing the foreign fishing in Somali waters. Thailand and Iran are two of the biggest players that are actually exploiting the fisheries within Somali waters, within their economic zone. So it's a huge problem, and there just isn't the ability for Somalia to enforce these illegal fishing operations, so it continues. And fish stocks are going to be completely depleted if this can't get solved. So there's a YouTube link you can take a look. It's a news update on Somalia and fishing. So take a look at that. It's through Al Jazeera, and then come back and we'll continue. Okay, so like I said, Iran is one of within the MENA region. Iran is one of the largest players in terms of illegally fishing in Somalia's waters, but they also do some illegal fishing in their own region. So again, let's talk about their regulations. Iran is a signatory of the Law of the Sea. They aren't a full party. So they've signed on, but they haven't fully ratified the Law of the Sea. But they have some of their own laws. They have something called the Law of Protection and Exploitation of the Fisheries Resources. And this was adopted by the Iranian parliament into law, and it was signed into law in 1995. And it deals with the sustainable catch. It deals with the licensing. It deals with quotas and fish stock estimates and conservation. It deals with conservation in terms of which areas are going to be designated as marine protected areas or no-take zones, so areas where fishing is completely prohibited. So the Iranian Fisheries Organization called Shalat is the main agency responsible for fisheries and aquaculture management in Iran. So if we take a quick look at what Shalat is really in charge of, their role in all of this is really more towards a protective conservation role. So they are in charge of resource protection. They're in charge of rehabilitation of existing stocks. So what that means is when they determine a stock is being overexploited, they need to work with officials to determine how to rehabilitate that stock. So that could be in the form of a moratorium. A moratorium is something when you just say, no, we're not going to fish this species anymore, and sometimes it can last years. And again, that only works if you've got good regulation and if you've got good monitoring at the docks when people are bringing in their fish catch. And people out on the water just checking to see what they're fishing for, right? They also are in charge of trying to improve habitats. So habitat destruction is a huge issue in illegal fishing because they're using practices that are really damaging to the environment. So they're scouring the bottom, they're using dredges and trawls that just scratch everything on the seafloor and then throw everything else back that isn't their target. And you can see in this image here, this is a trawling net that brought up whatever it could catch on the ocean floor, and a lot of this will be junk species. There's some skates and rays, there looks like some eels in here, lots of flatfish, and they're probably not going for any of that. They're probably only going for shrimp, for example. So that is a huge issue in terms of stock assessments for other non-target species as well. Shalat is also responsible for the development of fish farming, so trying to find alternatives to wild caught fisheries. They also are responsible for the fish production through research and training and promoting technical services, very much like our NOAA is, the National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration, our government organization that's really in charge of regulating a lot of the fisheries within the United States. So they have a similar role to play as our NOAA organization does too. Shalat adopts regulations for the implementation of the 1994 law in coordination with the Department of Environment. It all sounds great, but it's only going to work if you have collaboration, cooperation, and a willingness of, of all parties to want to drive towards a more sustainable fishery. One of the largest exploited fisheries in Iran is the shrimp fishery. It's both fished with artisanal fishermen and also industrial scale fisheries. And it's both illegal and legal, but they take a lot of shrimp. For shrimp, they have an open season of just a couple of months. They can only fish in October and November. And then outside of that, within June and July, for instance, that's completely off. That there's no fishing for shrimp during that time. But of course, that isn't always the case. There is some illegal fishing that goes on for sure. The methods that are used for the shrimp fishery, they're usually small outboard engine kinds of powered boats. So they're usually kind of small, and they usually use what you can see here. This is a drift net. So they have it's a drift gill net. So you have a net that's attached to the back of the boat. They lower this in. You see the floats along here. That's the top of the net. And then at the bottom of the net, there's usually a lead chain that goes along the bottom. And it literally just scoops through. It sits on the ocean floor and then scratches everything up and catches it in that net. A report on illegal shrimp fishing in Hormozgan. Wow. This region, this red region right here in Iran, in southern Iran, this is the Hormozgan region. It's one province in Iran, and it's one of the areas that's the largest for activity in the shrimp fishing industry. And it was estimated that about 800 boats were in the waters off of southern Iran, and they were all fishing illegally for shrimp. So that has a huge impact on the shrimp fishery, right? About 30,000 fishermen are employed in the shrimp fishery. And the Hormozgan province is really the fishing hub of the country. It's one of the largest regions for shrimp to get shrimp from in the fisheries. It produces about 240,000 tons of shrimp a year. So it's a very large industry. It's one of the largest in the region. One of the main concerns facing the Persian Gulf is this illegal activity for shrimp fishing. The capture of shrimp during the close season in July and October still occurs. If you remember from the previous slide, the legal times of the year when you can fish for shrimp is in October and November. But in the summer months leading up to the fall, they're still fishing for shrimp illegally. And so in recent years, the total marine shrimp catch has decreased, like really collapsed, almost 40% of the number of fish or shrimp that are caught now compared to a few decades ago. So some of the reasons for that, of course, is the uptick in illegal activity that has occurred over the last few years, and also from oil pollution and habitat destruction. So shrimp they live on the ocean floor, and they need areas within their habitat for hiding spaces, because they sort of hide in the crevices of coral reefs or just rubble that's on the sea floor. But because of the habitat destruction that occurs from the actual fishing for these guys, their habitat has been destroyed, and so they're not coming back to where they were. And also, shrimp are a brackish species, which means they prefer to be in neither full marine water or full fresh water. They like a mix of both fresh and salt water. And so as in some of the regions, the freshwater flow from the land has decreased, the estuarine environments are becoming like more marine environments. And so the shrimp are just no longer there because of the change in the oceanography. Okay, so what I wanted to do really quickly is look at the MENA region real time to show you what's going on in terms of fishing activity. The Global Fishing Watch is a non-profit organization, and they use satellite imagery to capture real-time fishing activity that's going on around the world. So I have the link here for you, but I'll go and look it up. Oh, and note while we're looking at this, look at the areas where the fish are being caught in international waters. Fish that are caught within a country's economic zone, the exclusive economic zone, are managed by that country. Outside of that, it's regulated by the regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, and their member countries. So there's several sections within the world that are international waters are not owned by anyone, right? But they have to be regulated, and that's even more difficult to regulate. It's even more difficult to enforce, and even more difficult to monitor. But there are regional groups that attempt to do that, and it's a collaboration between many different countries. And there are fleets that will go out onto international waters and do spot checks, and climb aboard and see if everything's license-wise is all copacetic. But by and large, it's really under monitored. So there's a lot of illegal operations that are going on in international waters because of that. Okay, so I'm going to go to the Global Fishing Watch website. I think I'm going to, I think I'm right there. All right, so let me zoom out and show you guys. This is really cool. What you're looking at is all of these green areas that are circles or lines around a country's border. That is showing you the area of their exclusive economic zone. So since we've been talking about Somalia, let's have a look over here. Here's Somalia's exclusive economic zone. Here's the contested area with Kenya. And in fact, they haven't even left on the northern part of Somalia's exclusive economic zone, because this is sort of Yemeni territory. So this might be more up to date than the report that I had. But anyway, so you can see all of the different countries' exclusive economic zones. And these little blue areas that you're seeing here, this is apparent fishing effort. So every one of these blue dots is showing you a fishing vessel or a fishing boat that is operating in those waters. So there's a lot of fishing activity going on in the Somali EEZ and also out in international waters. So if we zoom in just a little bit more, here we have, you can see the fishing activity occurring. This is, let me show you guys this. If you press play, it shows you the tracks of the different fishing vessels. So every one of these little dots is an area where fishing has been occurring. So if I can click on, what I'm hoping for is that you can see the track of the actual vessel at the time. Oh, I'm trying to get my cursor to go over loading vessel information. Okay, so here we have this. So here it shows you the ship, and it's flying a flag from China, and it's in international waters off the coast of Somalia. And so if you press play, it shows you the track that ship has taken and now see it went inside the exclusive economic zone of Somalia. So that is most likely an illegal ship that's crossing from international to the Somali EEZ. So that's just one example. And if you were to spend some time playing around on this, it's a really cool interactive map. And that was even taken from It gives you the date that this happened. When was that? Click here and log in. We don't want to do that. But it tells you the date that that fishing activity has occurred. So this is a really cool little website for you to play around with. You can have a look at other countries if you want. But yeah, it's really neat. So I encourage you to have a look around and play with that. So here we can see some international water fishing operations going on in international waters here as well. So anyway, yeah, have a look, play around with it, and hopefully you'll start to realize how much illegal fishing is going on around the world. So let's get back to our PowerPoint. How do I oops, here we go. Uh-oh. Okay. All right. So something I wanted to also bring to your attention was not all countries' activity in the illegal fishing industry is increasing. In some countries, it's actually going down, if you believe the reports, right? And Egypt is one of those examples. And Egypt recognizes that aquaculture is most likely the only possible solution to increasing fish production in Egypt that is both sustainable for their population and viable, because they realize that so many of the fish stocks are just crashing that they need to have an alternative if they're going to feed their growing population. Aquaculture in Egypt employs about 43,000 people in the industry, and the total aquaculture production in Egypt reached about 705,000 tons in 2009, which was a total market value of about 1,354 million US dollars. So it's a huge industry, and at the moment, the production of fish farming in Egypt is actually outdoing any of the wild caught fisheries. So it's really on the rise. This map is actually an interactive map. So I'm going to check it out. I'm going to go back to this map and show you guys. If you scroll down, you'll get to this interactive map. And if you click on, let me zoom in, I guess. If you click on the little fish farm, it gives you some information. It will tell you where the fish farm is operating, and it tells you how much space is taken up by the fish farm. So in this case, it's 42 hectares, and the species. So this fish farm in particular is farming and raising mullet and shrimp. And it also gives you the issues associated with that fish farm. So it lists tourism is an issue. So more than likely, because of the fish farm being there, the soil and water quality has decreased, and the habitat that they're using has probably done some damage to the environment. They're using ponds, which are more than likely outdoor ponds, and so it's kind of decreasing the way in which the environment looks, would be my bet. Let's have a look at someone else over here. This is a really big farm. It's pretty intense, and it's farming multiple different species. So mullet, tilapia, sea bream, sea bass, and miagri. Yeah. They're using cages and ponds, and it also tells you some of the issues facing that fish farm. So there is a lack of hatcheries in marine. It's in an urban environment, and they have water use policy and road construction occurring at that fish farm apparently. So anyway, you can take a look here as well and click on some of the other fish farms just to get an idea of the extent. One of the things also to think about is, remember Dr. Stanley was talking about how fish farming was increasing. And on the one hand, it's good because it solves the wild fisheries issue. But on the other, if you remember, Dr. Stanley was talking about how a lot of these fish farming operations are filling in wetlands, and they're reclaiming some of the wetland area in the Nile Delta. So it's having a bit of an impact locally when you're looking at, you know, the change in the habitat that's occurring due to fish farming. So there's good and bad that's occurring in terms of aquaculture, right? And also water quality can be a huge issue. If you look at a lot of these fish farms that are right on the coast and on tributaries, a lot of the effluent from fish farms are really high in nitrogenous waste, so high in nitrogen, and then that water becomes eutrophic. And we've talked about why eutrophic situations are bad, what that can do to the environment. So, you know, Egypt is not immune to those water quality issues either, which is a shame, because on the one hand, it's sustainably producing protein, but on the other, it's causing some environmental destruction as well. Okay, that's all I have for now. I thought I actually had something else. There's a video. Where did that go? It's on Somalia. Oh yeah, I did show you that. Okay. All right. So that's all I have talking about the fishing industry. Hopefully that was interesting, food for thought. And if you've read your chapter in your book, that will set you up for, you know, more detail with Somalia as well. So, all right, I will see you next time.